two faiths, one battlefield. At Grunwald in 1410, Europe's last great crusading army met a force that defied expectation. The Teutonic Knights, masters of the Baltic for centuries, faced Poland's disciplined ranks alongside Lithuania's fierce cavalry, nations united by necessity. For King Jagiełło and Grand Duke Vytautas, cousins bound by survival, this wasn't merely battle, but vindication. Their victory broke the Order's dominion and reshaped Northern Europe forever. In one summer day, amid Polish meadows, the medieval world pivoted. A crusading age built on divine certainty yielded to one where kings, not popes, determined destiny. His name was Jagiełło, son of Algirdas, heir to the last pagan realm of Europe. Behind him stretched a land of forests and fire, still whispering the prayers of older gods. Before him, across the Niemen River, moved men who carried faith as if it were a weapon. The dawn was pale over the water, turning even the light fog into mist. From the high bank, the boy watched the day spread through the forest, catching the glint of distant helms beyond the trees. The air smelled of pine smoke and iron. Below, where the river bent around a cluster of huts, only ash remained, charred wood, fallen idols, silence. He did not move. He had seen smoke before, but not like this. The fire on the far shore did not die with the night. It burned as though morning itself had consented to it. Somewhere among that haze rode the men who called themselves Brothers of the Cross, the soldiers of the German house of St. Mary in Jerusalem. They had come north long ago, carrying the memory of deserts and holy wars, and they would not leave until the last of the heathen gods had been silenced. The Teutonic Order had not been born here. Its vows were first spoken under the blinding sun of the Holy Land, where German pilgrims tended the sick and buried the fallen among the ruins of Acre. When the final stronghold of Christendom fell to the east, those warriors were left without a crusade, but not without conviction. They turned from the sands to the snows, seeking another frontier where unbelief could be conquered. It was Duke Conrad of Masovia who summoned them, an invitation that would reshape the north. In the 1220s, harried by Prussian raids, Conrad promised the knights land if they would defend his borders and baptize his enemies. The bargain brought them to the Baltic shore, and there they built their kingdom of stone. Thorn, Elbing, Königsberg, fortresses rose like prayers answered in iron. Marshes were drained, forests cut down, villages renamed in Latin tongues. The crusade had found a new Jerusalem amid pine and frost. Through that century, the Black Cross advanced, and with it, the gospel of conquest. Pagan Prussia was broken and subdued, its people scattered or baptized by the sword. Churches replaced temples. Saints' days replaced the rites of harvest and fire. Chroniclers in distant monasteries wrote of triumph, of a frontier purified for God. Yet east of the conquered lands, beyond the slow rivers that wound through endless forest, another people watched and waited. Lithuania was older than its name. It was not born from parchment or decree, but from the slow joining of tribes bound by oath and blood. Its strength lay in the woods and the silence between them, in riders who knew every marsh and track. Its lords were pagans still, their priests tending sacred flames, their warriors swearing by thunder and oak. The cross had not yet entered their forests, and they meant to keep it so. Under Gediminas, the Grand Duke who ruled from Vilnius, Lithuania became a realm both feared and courted. He wrote letters to the Pope, offered friendship to merchants from Lübeck and Riga, invited monks to preach in his cities, and yet he himself remained unbaptized. In his halls, Latin words mixed with the chants of ancient rites. He understood that power did not always lie in faith, but in appearing to possess it. His sons inherited that delicate balance. Algirdas fought eastward against the Tatars and the princes of Moscow. Kęstutis, his brother, turned west, guarding the frontier against the Brothers of the Cross. Between them, they held back the flood, though every year the river ran redder. When the Teutonic Order burned one village, Lithuanian riders answered by setting fire to a Prussian fort. The war never ceased, it only slept when winter froze the rivers. The brothers of the Order called their struggle holy, their dead martyrs. The Lithuanians saw it as survival. Yet even among the forest tribes, change had begun. Captives returned from Prussia with tales of stone cities and bells that called men to prayer. Traders brought crosses carved from silver, not as idols, but as curiosities. The world beyond the trees was moving, and the gods of wood and fire could not stop it forever. Jagiełło was born into that slow dying of an age. His father, Algirdas, ruled wisely, but knew the end was coming. The order had grown too rich, too disciplined. Its fortresses guarded roads that once belonged to the pagans themselves. Each summer brought new crusaders, nobles from Germany, France, and England, seeking salvation through blood. Their banners shone across the fields of Samagitia, and their chronicles already spoke of victory. In Vilnius, the court whispered of alliances, of letters sent in secret to Poland and Hungary. Baptism was no longer an insult, but a bargaining chip. Algirdas hesitated, as had his father before him. To embrace the cross would mean survival, yet also surrender. To reject it would mean fire without end. When Algirdas died, the burden passed to Jagiełło. Still young, he inherited not only a throne, but a war older than his name. His uncle Kęstutis, guardian of the old faith, stood beside him for a time, until the order's intrigue sowed suspicion between them. Soon the two were enemies, one clinging to the gods of the forest, the other weighing the power of the cross. In 1382, Kęstutis was taken prisoner by the very knights who had once feared him. Days later, he was found dead in their fortress. Whether by his own hand or another's, the message was the same. The old gods were dying, and their champions with them. His son Vytautas escaped through the marshes, disguised as a servant, swearing vengeance. Jagiełło, now alone, faced a future built on ashes. The order moved quickly, draping its greed in piety. They claimed to avenge Kęstutis, even as they raided deeper into Lithuania, burning villages and demanding conversion. Their priests preached of heathens who murdered fathers and betrayed, oaths. Their swords wrote the same story in blood, but no conquest followed. For every fortress they razed, the forest reclaimed another. Jagiełło watched and waited. He had learned patience from his father and caution from his uncle's fate. The order's might was vast, yet its victories hollow. Every war left it weaker, every truce shorter. He began to see a path that neither god nor knight could imagine, a union that would make baptism not a defeat, but a weapon of his own. One winter evening, he returned to the Nieman's Edge, to the place where the river curved beneath the birches. The ice was thin and blue beneath the moon. Across the water, the towers of the Order's fort stood black against the snow, their lights flickering like stars imprisoned in stone. He sat his horse in silence, listening to the wind move through the branches, and thought of what must come. Behind him, the forest stretched into darkness. The priests of the old faith still tended their sacred fires, but even they felt the cold of doubt. Before him, across the frozen river, waited the world that called itself Christian, hard, disciplined, unyielding. Between them stood one man, and the choice that would decide which would survive. When Jagiełło turned back toward Vilnius, the moonlight caught the frost in his hair. The forest murmured behind him, a last benediction from gods already fading. The next thaw would bring the river's flood, and with it the end of the age of fire. The Niemen thawed early that spring. Ice broke loose with the sound of splitting glass, and the current carried whole branches downstream, tokens from forests still half asleep. On the high bank near Grodno, scouts of the Teutonic Order watched the melting with quiet calculation. The river was both barrier and road, and when its chains broke, so too did truces. Across the border, Lithuanian riders began their own preparations. Smoke rose from smithies hidden in the woods. Horses were shod, arrows fletched. Each year the pattern repeated itself. The river froze, the swords rested, then the melt carried war again into the valleys. Yet this time, something deeper was shifting. The knights no longer rode only for faith. They rode for reputation, for plunder, for the habit of victory that had become its own creed. At Marienburg, the fortress that ruled their realm, Grand Master Vinrich von Kniprode held council beneath vaulted stone. His was the most disciplined of orders, men of noble blood, bound by monastic law, trained to pray before dawn and kill before noon. Their banners bore the black cross of Jerusalem, but their hearts longed less for paradise than for dominion. From Prussia to Livonia, their castles formed a chain of conquest, each stone a prayer answered in steel. Still, beneath that outward power ran unease. The wars against the Prussians had ended long ago. The land was subdued, the natives baptized or gone. Yet the brotherhood had not been made for peace. It needed enemies to justify its existence, and only one frontier remained: Lithuania. Chroniclers wrote of the unconverted East, of dark woods where witches whispered and idol fires burned through the night. To the knights, that vision was both terror and invitation. Sermons in the Cathedral of Königsberg promised salvation through crusade. Across Germany, nobles sold land or borrowed coin to join a campaign that promised indulgence and glory. Faith had become a currency, and Lithuania the market. In Vilnius, Jagiełło read these signs as carefully as he might read a treaty. He understood that war for the order was no longer about belief, but necessity. Without it, their vows would crumble into idleness. Their castles would turn to monuments rather than weapons. If he could not outfight them, perhaps he could outweight them. His council was divided. The old boyars muttered that patience was cowardice, that the gods demanded action. Priests of Perkunaz warned that the storms would turn against those who forgot the ancient rites. Yet younger nobles, sons of men who had seen too much burning, listened to the whispers coming from Poland. There, a new queen ruled, a girl named Jadwiga, chosen by the lords of Krakow to restore their kingdom's strength. To her, Jagiełło's messengers carried cautious words: friendship, alliance, marriage. The idea seemed impossible. The heir of pagans and the child queen of a Christian realm. What could bind them but ambition? Yet in the hidden rooms of Vilnius, where wax dripped from candles and the maps were drawn with trembling quills, the plan took shape. To marry Jadwiga, Jagiełło would accept baptism. To accept baptism, he would turn his entire land toward the cross. It was not faith that guided him, but calculation. He had seen too clearly what happened to those who fought holiness with fire. The Teutonic Knights had used the cross to enslave their neighbors. He would use it to disarm them. If Lithuania embraced Christianity on its own terms, the Order's crusade would lose its divine excuse. Their swords would hang idle, their coffers empty. Still, the risk was immense. Conversion would not only anger his nobles, it would unravel centuries of ritual. The gods of forest and field had shaped every birth, every oath. To abandon them was to cut the root of identity itself. Jagiełło hesitated, knowing that once the first bell rang in Vilnius, the old world would begin to crumble. That year, envoys from Marienburg rode again to his court. They came draped in white cloaks, bearing letters sealed with wax and Latin words promising peace, if only Lithuania would open itself to their guidance. Jagiełło received them in silence. When they departed, he followed their path with eyes that gave nothing away. He knew that peace offered by swords was only delay before another attack. Meanwhile, the order pressed harder along the border. Villages on the upper Niemen were burned, captives were taken, branded with the sign of the cross, and marched westward to labor in Prussian fields. In retaliation, Lithuanian raiders struck the castle of Insterburg by night, setting its stables aflame before vanishing into the trees. The chronicles record these acts in the language of sin and penance. To those who lived them, they were simply survival. As the years passed, war became rhythm. Winter truce, spring raid, summer siege. Men grew old who had never known peace, and children learned to distinguish the hoofbeats of their enemies long before they learned to pray. The Order's chronicles spoke of heathens who could not be taught. Lithuanian bards sang of knights who could not be sated. Each side needed the other to define its righteousness. Yet history, patient as a river, erodes certainties as surely as it shapes them. In 1385, after months of secret negotiation, word reached Marienburg that the pagan duke had agreed to the impossible. Jagiełło would take baptism under the name Władysław, marry Queen Jadwiga of Poland, and join his land with hers beneath one crown. The ink was scarcely dry before the bells of Krakow rang out in celebration, and the Brothers of the Cross realized their crusade had been stolen from them. The Order's fury was holy and human in equal measure. They accused Jagiełło of false conversion, of feigned piety meant only to shield his armies. They claimed that the baptism of a nation performed by politics could not cleanse the stain of idolatry. Their preachers thundered in pulpits from Riga to Lübeck, calling for a new war to prove the deceit. But in the halls of Europe, their voices no longer carried as they once had. A baptized Lithuania was no longer fair prey. In Vilnius, churches rose where sacred groves had stood. The old idols were cut down, their wood used for beams and doors. Water was poured over heads that had once bowed to fire. Some accepted the change quietly. Others fled into the forests, carrying the names of the gods in whispers. The chronicles call it conversion, but it was more often confusion, a mingling of prayers old and new, each uttered with the same trembling hope that the sky might listen. Jagiełło watched all this with the calm of a man who knows the cost of his own survival. He had traded eternity for security, but the bargain held. The Teutonic Knights could no longer brandish the cross against him without seeming the aggressor. For the first time, their faith worked against them. Still, even victories bought with cunning cast long shadows. Vytautas, Kęstutis' exiled son, returned from refuge among the Order, claiming his father's legacy. The cousins met not as brothers, but as rivals, one baptized, one still bound to the forest's silence. Their struggle would soon decide not only the shape of Lithuania, but the fate of the crusade itself. For now, the rivers ran clear again. The smoke thinned, and in Krakow's cathedral, candles burned before the altar, where Jadwiga and her foreign husband stood crowned. The cross gleamed above them, not as symbol of surrender, but as shield against the past. Beyond the walls, snow began to fall, soft, relentless, erasing the tracks of the Teutonic scouts who still roamed the border. In the white hush of that winter, Europe held its breath. The pagan age was over, yet the wars of faith had only changed their language. The boy who once watched smoke over the Niemen was now a king, his name spoken in two tongues, his soul claimed by two worlds. And though the bells of Krakow rang for peace, their echo carried northward, across frozen rivers and dark forests, to the men of the Black Cross who waited still for vengeance. Krakow's bells had scarcely fallen silent when doubts began to sound in their place. Across the Vistula, priests praised the miracle of a pagan realm redeemed. Yet in the taverns and councils of nobles, the question lingered. Could a man who once prayed to thunder truly rule in the name of Christ? Even in Vilnius, where the first churches rose on ground, still warm from burnt offerings, the scent of sacrifice clung to the air. Jagiełło, now Władysław, crowned king of Poland, moved through these twin worlds with care. He had traded the fire of Perkunas for the candlelight of cathedrals, but the forest still walked beside him. To the Poles, he was the baptized stranger. To the Lithuanians, the prince who had sold the old gods for a crown. Between them lay not only distance, but disbelief. The road that joined Krakow and Vilnius wound through miles of contested earth. Along its way stood half-rebuilt fortresses, and the graves of men who had fought beneath opposite banners. Messengers rode it daily, Polish scribes with letters sealed in wax, Lithuanian envoys wrapped in furs, their saddlebags heavy with tribute or complaint. The Union of Creva had bound two nations by parchment, but it had not yet joined their hearts. Far to the north, Vytautas watched from exile. The son of Kęstutis had once fled through frozen marshes with the Teutonic hounds behind him. Now he bided his time within their walls. The order welcomed him as weapon and witness, proof that the new king's baptism was false, that Lithuania's soul still resisted the cross. They called him friend and swore to restore his father's throne. Vytautas smiled and learned their tongues, their customs, their arrogance. He knew that faith could serve ambition as easily as betrayal. In Krakow's Wawel castle, Queen Jadwiga and her foreign husband ruled side by side, a pair both admired and doubted. She, barely beyond girlhood, possessed the serene conviction of the devout. He, the caution of one who had seen too much of fire. Together they presided over a court where languages mingled like colours in stained glass. Polish, Ruthenian, German, Latin, and the still new speech of Lithuania, rough yet proud. When she prayed for unity, he calculated its price. Conversion spread outward from the royal chapel in concentric rings, baptisms in the rivers, marriages blessed under new rites, altars raised atop the ruins of shrines. Yet beneath each gesture of faith ran the quiet hum of compromise. Pagan customs returned in disguise, candles lit at the same stones where sacrifices once burned, saints whose names echoed those of forgotten deities. Missionaries called it progress. The peasants called it habit. The old and the new learned to live in the same breath. The Teutonic Knights, robbed of their holy excuse, seethed behind their walls. At Marienburg, Grandmaster Konrad von Wallenrode ordered new campaigns, declaring that Lithuania's baptism was deceit. His envoys carried letters to the papal court accusing Jagiełło of mockery and heresy. The Pope listened politely and blessed both sides. He had no wish to extinguish a war that still paid indulgences. In the frontier provinces, the Brothers of the Cross returned to their old rhythm. Raids dressed as pilgrimages, sieges baptized as penance. Their banners once more darkened the Nieman's banks, and villages newly christened were burned as if to test their sincerity. In reply, Vytautas, now reconciled with his cousin through necessity, sent riders westward. The two men who had nearly destroyed each other found in the order a hatred fierce enough to bind them. Their reconciliation began in secrecy. On a misted night near Grodno, emissaries from both camps met beside a ruined watchtower. No priest blessed the meeting, no scribe recorded it. By dawn, the cousins had agreed to what neither could achieve alone. Jagiełło would remain king of Poland and overlord of Lithuania. Vytautas would rule the duchy as Grand Duke beneath him. Their unity would be fragile, but even a fragile bond could outlast arrogance forged in iron. The months that followed tested that accord. Vytautas returned to Vilnius to rebuild what war had left. He rode through towns half converted, half ruined, his banners trailing smoke and incense alike. He rebuilt the city's wooden fortress in stone, modelled after those he had studied in Marienburg, and surrounded it with craftsmen who spoke more German than Lithuanian. From captured knights, he learned the geometry of siege and defence. From local elders, the patience of the forest. He was the bridge between two worlds, whether he wished to be or not. Meanwhile, in Krakow, Władysław Jagiełło, still uneasy beneath his Christian name, moved slowly through the labyrinth of Polish politics. The nobles who had chosen him expected obedience. He gave them endurance. They demanded gifts, offices, favours. He granted them time. His power lay not in command, but in silence, in the sense that his patience could outlast their schemes. The same calm that had watched fire on the Niemen now ruled a kingdom through stillness. By 1387, Lithuania's baptism was declared complete. Bishops were appointed, dioceses drawn, and Latin psalms echoed where the drums of harvest once sounded. Yet the conversion of hearts proved slower. In the villages, farmers still placed offerings of grain on thresholds. In the woods, unseen fires still burned for the thunder god. The church tolerated what it could not yet replace. A nation was being remade, not by miracle, but by exhaustion. The order refused to yield. Grand Master Wallenrode launched another invasion, claiming to defend the faith of the doubtful. His knights crossed the border in glittering columns, their armor reflecting the northern sun. But the campaign bogged down in forests that swallowed cavalry and rivers that betrayed their crossings. Lithuanian partisans struck from the shadows, vanished, and struck again. The Crusaders returned home thinner in men and thicker in excuses. Europe watched and judged. Chroniclers in Prague and Vienna began to write less of holy wars and more of politics. To them, Jagiełło's union with Poland appeared not as heresy, but as strategy, a new bulwark against the German orders whose zeal had turned to tyranny. The image of the pagan foe began to fade, replaced by that of a Christian king who spoke softly and ruled a vast, untamed realm. Still, unity had its price. In Krakow, some whispered that the Lithuanian king would favor his own people. In Vilnius, that he had betrayed them to foreigners. Even Vytautas, loyal in name, watched his cousin's growing prestige with unease. The cousins had made peace through necessity. Peace itself now threatened to make them rivals again. One evening, as the sun bled red behind the towers of Vilnius, Vytautas stood on the battlements and watched the smoke of distant villages drift eastward. Somewhere beyond those hills rode Teutonic scouts, marking new lines on old maps. He thought of their fortress at Marienburg, of its endless walls and its great hall lined with banners of conquest. To destroy it would be to end the century of humiliation. The idea took root in him, like a seed planted by vengeance. That night, he wrote to Jagiełło in Krakow, "The order will never rest while it still believes itself chosen. We must remind it that God does not always dwell behind walls of stone." In that single line, the next war began. The cross and the sword had changed names, but not nature. Faith had turned from weapon to shield, and both cousins were learning how to wield it. The peace that followed was too quiet to be trusted. Between Krakow and Vilnius, envoys spoke of brotherhood, but the roads they travelled were lined with charred fields. Each season, the truce was renewed, and each season, the Teutonic Order found a reason to test it. Along the Niemen, small wars flickered like sparks under snow. Captives were taken, ransomed, forgotten. It was not enough to call a crusade, but enough to keep hatred alive. Within that uneasy stillness, old ambitions began to stir. Vytautas returned to power in Lithuania, ruled as Grand Duke, but felt the weight of his cousin's crown above him. The Union had saved their realm, yet it had bound it in shadow. Jagiełło reigned from Krakow as king of two nations, while Vytautas governed the lesser half, proud, restless, half-pagan still. Their accord, written in wax and Latin, was held together by memory more than trust. The Grand Duke's pride, once wounded by exile, healed into purpose. He strengthened the fortresses along the western marches, rebuilt castles at Trakai and Kaunas, trained men who could ride and vanish like wind. Lithuanian smiths learned the German forge. Foreign masons raised towers of brick beside wooden shrines. The land itself seemed divided, half looking to Rome, half listening to thunder. From Marienburg, the knights watched with cold fascination. To them, the cousins' unity was a mask, a trick to shield the heathen heart. Grand Master Konrad von Wallenrode sent letters to Vytautas promising aid should he rebel. He spoke of restoring the Grand Duke's sovereignty, of freeing him from Polish dominance. It was an old temptation, offered with practiced certainty. This time, Vytautas listened. Perhaps he wished to test his cousin's patience. Perhaps he sought to measure his own power. In 1389, he opened secret negotiations with the order. He promised land in Samogitia in exchange for support, swearing that Lithuania would stand apart from Poland once more. The Brothers of the Cross welcomed the intrigue as divine providence. They armed him, advised him, called him ally. Behind their courtesy, they sharpened plans to divide the Union before it could harden. When the plot was discovered, Jagiełło did not rage. He had learned that anger feeds rebellion. Instead, he tightened the web of loyalty, sending gold where armies would have been too loud. Lithuanian nobles who feared the order more than Poland began to drift back toward him. Vytautas, sensing the tide, turned on his new benefactors before they could claim his name. That winter, he fled Marienburg under the cover of night, disguised once again in humble garb, slipping past gates that had opened for him as guest, but would have closed on him as prisoner. The legend of his escape spread quickly. Chroniclers wrote of a servant guiding his horse through snow, of a storm that hid his trail, of a river crossing where ice cracked beneath his hooves. By the time he reached the border, the knights were already hunting him. They found only his empty camp and the ashes of his fire. When he reappeared in Vilnius months later, he was thinner, older, and colder than before. The man who returned was not the same one who had bargained for crowns in whispers. Cousin met cousin under guarded formality. No oaths were sworn that day, but something firmer was rebuilt, a shared knowledge of danger. The Teutonic Order had nearly destroyed them both. Whatever rivalry remained between Krakow and Vilnius would have to wait until that threat was ended. Their reconciliation was sealed, not by feast or treaty, but by action. Together, they began to prepare. Roads were cleared between Poland and Lithuania. Messengers carried coded orders across the frontier. Smithies worked through the night. Monks blessed weapons instead of relics. War had become inevitable, not through hatred, but through momentum. The order, too, gathered its strength. In Marienburg's halls, banners of guest knights hung beside the Black Cross, emblems of lords from France, Bavaria, and England who came to earn salvation in the northern cold. Priests preached of Lithuania's false baptism. Poets wrote of the crusade reborn. The walls of the fortress echoed with hymns and the ring of hammers. Faith was once more being forged into iron. Meanwhile, in Krakow, Jagiełło ruled with his patient gravity. The nobles pressed him for favors, the clergy for proof of zeal. He gave both just enough to preserve peace. To Vytautas, he sent measured letters, calm words masking strategic precision. They spoke of faith and friendship, but beneath them lay the blueprint of a campaign. The cousins were learning to play war as a language. When the first skirmishes flared again along the border, they no longer surprised anyone. Villages were razed, fortresses tested, scouts vanished into fog. The Teutonic Order claimed defense, Poland claimed retaliation. In truth, both were rehearsing for a greater reckoning. In 1392, the cousins met once more, this time under open sky at Ostrów. They stood amid frost and banners and swore anew their alliance. Vytautas would remain Grand Duke under Jagiełło's crown, free in rule but bound in loyalty. The Order, hearing of the pact, called it betrayal. Its priests thundered that Satan himself sat on Lithuania's throne. Yet the world beyond their walls had changed. No longer did Christendom see Jagiełło as a heathen in disguise. He had become the embodiment of a different faith, measured, political, alive. Years followed that blurred battle and diplomacy together. Armies marched, treaties shifted, borders smoldered but held. Vytautas expanded eastward into the vastness of the steppe. Jagiełło consolidated his power among the Polish lords. When famine struck Prussia, the knights prayed harder, but their fields withered all the same. For the first time in generations, the balance tilted against them. Triumph, when it came, was never loud in these lands. It arrived like a thaw, slow, unstoppable, indifferent to celebration. Along the Niemen, watchtowers fell silent. Traders from Danzig began to cross the border without escort. Priests argued over the meaning of peace. And in the forests, where once the fires of sacrifice had burned, farmers planted grain on the same blackened soil. Still, the silence carried tension. Both sides knew that such calm could not last. The Teutonic Order, stripped of crusade, yet swollen with pride, could not survive without war, and the cousins, bound by wary affection, could not share the same victory forever. On a night thick with rain, Vytautas rode the ramparts of Trakai and looked toward the west. Lightning flickered over the horizon, far beyond the forests, perhaps above Marienburg itself. He felt no fear, only certainty. The next storm would not be fought for conversion or for faith. It would be for memory, for vengeance, for the right to decide whose cross would cast its shadow over the north. Snow fell on Marienburg like sifted ash. Along the ramparts, torches hissed and guttered in the wind, their light sliding over the frozen river below. In the courtyard, a line of knights knelt before a man, dressed in white and black, his cloak embroidered with the cross that had come to rule their lives. His name was Ulrich von Jungingen. He was young still, proud of face, his voice hard as the frost that rhymed the stones. When he spoke the oath, every man repeated it after him, each word binding them more tightly than iron. The old Grand Master, Konrad von Wallenrode, had died without seeing his crusade fulfilled. Now his successor swore that the order would not rest until Lithuania's deceit was punished. To the brothers of the cross, baptism had become a wound that refused to heal. Their chronicles still called the Lithuanians heathen. Their sermons declared that the devil himself wore a Christian crown in Krakow. In Ulrich's mind, the campaign ahead would cleanse both sin and insult. That winter, the rivers froze deep enough to bear armies. Across the frontier, Polish and Lithuanian scouts reported new musters in Prussia, columns of men moving between castles, carts loaded with iron and grain, guest knights arriving from distant lands. Some came for faith, others for plunder, most for glory. The order's prestige had dimmed since the days of conquest, but its wealth still glittered enough to draw ambition. To fight under the Black Cross was to earn indulgence and reputation in one stroke. In Vilnius, Vytautas listened to these tidings in silence. His hair had begun to grey, though his eyes had not lost their fire. He had ruled long enough to know that peace in these lands was only another word for preparation. Every castle the order built pressed closer to his borders. Every truce concealed another campaign. The forests that had once protected Lithuania were now crisscrossed by roads wide enough for wagons of siege engines. The enemy had learned patience, and patience, he knew, was more dangerous than zeal. He answered in kind. Along the Niemen, new fortresses rose under his command, brick and timber bastions, garrisoned by men who could fight by moonlight as easily as by sun. Lithuanian smiths cast heavier armor. Ruthenian bowyers crafted stronger yew. Messengers rode between Vilnius and Krakow under cover of darkness, carrying maps marked with rivers, crossings, and supplies. The cousins were no longer bound merely by treaty. They were preparing for survival. Yet alliance was not friendship. Jagiełło ruled with the same quiet distance that had once saved his throne. His letters to Vytautas were polite, precise, never warm. Between them lay too much history, betrayal forgiven but not forgotten. Still, both understood that division would invite disaster. Each kept watch over the other, as wary allies must. For the common people, the war had no names. It came as smoke over the horizon, hoofbeats in the dark, prayers whispered for sons who did not return. Villages near the frontier were emptied and rebuilt so often that no one could say which generation had first laid the stones. In spring, the order raided deep into Samogitia, claiming to enforce the faith. In summer, Lithuanian riders struck back, burning Prussian outposts to their foundations. The land between them became a graveyard of treaties. The chroniclers of the order called these conflicts small wars, but they were not small to those who lived them. Peasants fled to forests that no longer offered safety. Monasteries were fortified. Even priests carried swords beneath their robes. In winter, when the rivers froze solid, both sides used them as roads. Knights rode across white plains to surprise settlements asleep in the dark, while Lithuanian scouts waited in the trees with bows already drawn. The Niemen ran red each spring when the thaw returned. Still, amid that chaos, Vytautas built something enduring. He reorganized the Lithuanian host, forming units of heavy cavalry to match the knights' discipline. Ruthenian engineers introduced the new siege engines of the south, catapults that hurled stones the weight of men, towers that rolled on wooden wheels. Fortresses that once fell in days now held for months. Even in the ruins, order began to take shape. At the same time, Jagiełło strengthened Poland's internal web. The nobles, bound by privilege, were unpredictable allies. He courted them with patience, granting favors sparingly, never completely. He understood that a king who rules through affection soon rules nothing. His court became a center of quiet diplomacy, drawing envoys from Hungary, Bohemia, and the Empire. Each came seeking advantage. Each left uncertain which side he favored. Ulrich von Jungingen saw this balance and despised it. To him, negotiation was cowardice, patience an affront to divine purpose. He sent envoys to the Pope demanding sanction for renewed crusade, declaring that the faith in Lithuania was false and that its king profaned Christ by sharing rule with pagans. He embellished his claims with relics and testimonies. Forged or true, it mattered little. What mattered was that the papal seal might once more adorn a war. By 1400, Europe had grown weary of holy causes, yet the notion of righteous battle still carried weight. From the Rhineland to Burgundy, knights began to speak again of Prussia and of the sinless north, where honor could be reborn. The order opened its treasuries to fund them. Across the Baltic, ship after ship unloaded pilgrims of the sword. In Vilnius, Vytautas watched the horizon darken. His spies returned with reports of massive preparations, new forges, endless stores of grain. Fortifications doubled along the Vistula. The Grand Master was no longer content with raids. He was planning a reckoning. Vytautas sent word to Krakow. The storm gathers. If we stand apart, it will wash us both away. Jagiełło read the letter in the candlelight of his chapel. The walls glowed with gold and saints, but his thoughts were of mud and blood. He had spent his life turning survival into faith, patience into weapon. He knew what was coming, even before the scouts confirmed it. The Order was preparing for a war that would decide the fate of the North. Through the next years, the tension coiled tighter. The borderlands became fields of espionage. Messengers intercepted, letters altered, alliances courted and broken. Merchants were accused of spying. Monks carried hidden codes in their psalters. The silence before the storm deepened until even the birds seemed to sense it. In Prussia, Ulrich inspected his knights personally, riding from castle to castle, his pale horse shrouded in the Order's colors. Chroniclers noted his precision, his obsession with ceremony, his belief that purity of rule would bring victory. He was no politician, only a soldier who believed that righteousness could be proved by steel. His faith was as inflexible as the towers he commanded. By 1409, the first open clashes began again in Samogitia, where neither side could claim peace. The Order demanded the province in payment for Vytautas's old alliance. He refused, calling it theft in the name of memory. Raids flared across the Niemen. Castles burned. Each side accused the other of blasphemy. And somewhere between these cries, the last threads of diplomacy snapped. Winter settled once more on the frontier. Along the river, patrols passed one another in silence, each aware that the next meeting would be war. The snow muffled every sound, but beneath it, the earth was already trembling with what would come. In Marienburg, Ulrich von Jungingen knelt before the altar, his sword laid flat across the stone, praying for a victory he believed preordained. In Vilnius, Vytautas unrolled maps beneath candlelight, the wax dripping like slow blood over the borders. Neither man knew how near their destinies had drawn. Between them stretched only one winter, and when the thaw came, it would carry more than ice down the river. It would carry the march of nations. When the spring of 1409 broke, it carried not warmth, but rumour. Across the Baltic, ships arrived laden with mail and banners. Guest knights from the Rhineland, from Franconia, from far-off England, each answering the Order's summons. They came to cleanse sin by battle, to carve glory from heathen soil. In the harbours of Danzig and Elbing, armour shone brighter than the sea. The people whispered that another crusade had been born. In Marienburg, Ulrich von Jungingen received them with the solemn grace of a priest. His fortress, part monastery and part citadel, hummed with purpose. Bells tolled for matins and vespers. Forges roared between prayers. The great hall was hung with tapestries of past triumphs. The fall of Prussia, the baptism of Livonia, the burning of Samogitian idols. To Ulrich, these were not memories, but mandates. The order's strength had been built upon conquest, and peace had nearly ruined it. Only war could prove its sanctity anew. Yet beyond those red brick walls, the world had changed. Europe no longer looked to the Teutonic Knights as saviors, but as relics of an age that refused to die. Their devotion had hardened into arrogance, their discipline into pride. Still, their coffers were deep, their armies vast, and their enemies divided, at least in appearance. To the south, Jagiełło moved with his usual quiet. In Krakow's cathedral, he prayed each morning before an image of Saint Stanislaw, and when he rose from the kneeler, his expression was unreadable. Courtiers who mistook his stillness for hesitation often found themselves outmaneuvered by it. Beneath the calm rituals of faith, he was already building the greatest host the North had ever seen. His letters went out to every corner of the realm, to Mazovia, to Ruthenia, to the border towns of the Tatars. He summoned levies, bargained with nobles, promised coin and privilege in exchange for loyalty. For weeks, scribes worked by candlelight, sealing commands that would move thousands. When the order struck, he meant to be ready. In Vilnius, Vytautas answered with the energy his cousin lacked but valued. Messengers rode through the night to every castle in Lithuania, bearing orders sealed with his signet. The Samogitian clans, long restive under the order's shadow, were called to rise again. They gathered in forests still scarred by old burnings, their axes glinting in the sun, their banners marked not with saints, but with wolves and horses. The uprising spread like wildfire. One after another, the order's garrisons fell, some to storm, some to desertion. Churches were emptied, crosses thrown into rivers. The Crusaders had called Samogitia their own for a generation. Now it was slipping from their hands. Ulrich's response was swift. He declared a holy war, not only against the rebels, but against those who had inspired them. His envoys rode to the courts of Europe, proclaiming that the King of Poland and his pagan cousin had conspired to undo Christendom. Indulgences were renewed. Coin flowed like blood. In the summer of that year, his armies crossed the Niemen again. They burned villages to the ground, hung prisoners from church doors, and sent the ashes drifting eastward. The war had begun in earnest. Vytautas countered with precision learned from his enemies. His riders struck deep into Prussia, harassing supply lines, ambushing patrols. They vanished into marshes where the knight's heavy armor turned to burden. He gave the order no battle it could boast of, only wounds that never healed. Chroniclers called these campaigns raids, but they were the anatomy of survival, small victories that drained the faith of giants. Through it all, Jagiełło remained the strategist unseen. He refused to commit his main force, knowing the order wanted a grand clash before his allies could gather. Instead, he sent priests to preach restraint, envoys to demand peace, and spies to count the banners on Marienburg's walls. To his nobles, he said little. They mistook silence for indecision, not realizing it was the patience of a hunter. Winter closed over the battlefields, muting everything but memory. In frozen fields where men had died, crows gathered by the hundreds. The Order's knights retreated to their fortresses. Lithuanian scouts watched from the tree lines, unseen. When peace envoys met at Torun, they found only words sharpened like daggers. Each side accused the other of treachery. Each prayed that spring would bring vindication. That spring did come, but not the peace they pretended to seek. In early 1410, the Order seized border towns in Dobrzyn land, claiming them as holy recompense. Jagiełło's patience ended there. He sent his heralds riding through the kingdom, calling banners to war. Across Poland and Lithuania, churches echoed with the sound of bells, not for mass, but for mustering. Men who had tilled the same soil for generations took up spear and axe. The time for diplomacy had passed. In Marienburg, Ulrich von Jungingen gathered his commanders. The chroniclers say his voice carried through the vaulted hall like iron striking stone. "We shall meet them in the open field," he said, "and God himself will judge." He believed it. All his life had been preparation for this moment, when the Order would prove again that divine favor belonged to discipline and to purity of cause. He could not see that the age which had made him possible was already dying. In Vilnius, Vytautas stood beneath the great oak in his courtyard as messengers arrived one after another. His armor had been repaired so often that no piece matched the other. His sword bore the nicks of 3 decades of war. He looked to the west, where thunder rolled through the sky was clear. "So it begins," he said quietly, and ordered the banners raised. By midsummer, all Europe would know their names. But on that last evening before the march, the rivers ran still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The forests were full of birds that had not yet fled. In Krakow, Jagiełło prayed before the crucifix in the royal chapel. In Marienburg, Ulrich knelt before the same symbol carved in stone. Between them stretched a land weary of faith, but unable to escape it. Soon the banners of the Black Cross would ride again, and the answer to every prayer would come in blood. Spring broke loose from winter, like a prisoner escaping its cell. Ice cracked on the Vistula, and the rivers began to carry the rumor everyone had been waiting for. War was coming. From Krakow to Vilnius, messengers rode with wax-sealed orders. By dawn, every village knew which banners would rise. Across Lesser Poland, fields turned into roads. Knights brought their retainers. Peasants followed with carts of grain, priests with relics wrapped in linen. The white eagle of the crown flew again over the highways that led north. Beneath it came men who had spent their lives defending the same border. Farmers, masons, students from monasteries who had traded parchment for pike. Władysław Jagiełło rode from Wawel at their head, his armor plain, his eyes unreadable. He carried no words of glory, only the calm of a man who had waited long for justice. Trumpets called once, and the host began to move. First the nobles and their lancers, then the endless column of wagons, archers, smiths, cooks, carpenters, and children too young to understand that they were walking into legend. Far to the northeast, Vilnius shook with the same awakening. Vytautas stood on the castle ramparts watching smoke rise from forges. Banners of Lithuania, Ruthenia, and Samogitia gathered below him, joined by Tatar horsemen whose curved bows gleamed in the dawn. Mercenaries from Bohemia and Moravia rode in with banners still scorched from old wars. The sound of the host forming was like the forest breathing after a storm, heavy, alive, inevitable. When the cousins met at the river crossing near Chervinsk, the Vistula lay swollen and dangerous. To move an army across it was to gamble with providence. Engineers bound boats together into a floating road. each plank trembling under the weight of faith and wood. By dusk, the bridge stretched across the water, narrow as salvation, but strong enough to carry nations. At sunrise, the Polish cavalry crossed first, steel glinting, banners bending with the wind. Behind them came the Lithuanian riders, their horses stamping nervously on the shifting boards. Peasants followed with wagons creaking under barrels and grain. The river swallowed the sound of their steps, and yet they kept moving, drawn forward by purpose older than any oath. Midway across, Jagiełło dismounted. He walked barefoot on the wet planks, crucifix pressed to his chest, the current churning below like memory refusing to rest. Vytautas rode beside him on the far bank, his armor dulled by mist. The two said nothing, but when their eyes met, the silence felt like covenant. Behind them, the army roared as its last divisions reached land. The bridge had held. The road to the north was open. They camped that night on Masovian soil. Fires burned for miles, and smoke drifted low through the trees. Priests moved from circle to circle with absolution. Smiths hammered blades until sparks leapt like stars. Men from 10 tongues shared food and silence. For the first time in memory, Poland and Lithuania stood as one host. Beyond the river, Marienburg answered with its own awakening. Inside the red fortress, Ulrich von Jungingen walked the great hall, lined with trophies of older wars. Guest knights from France, Burgundy, and the Empire filled his tables, boasting of the victory they would bring to God. When the wine had gone, he left them to their songs and climbed the ramparts alone. From the towers, he could see the reflection of his own banners in the river below, black crosses floating on broken light. "They will come," he murmured. "Let them test the will of the Lord." While the Order prepared its crusade, the Allied host began its slow march through Masovia. The road wound between forests and lakes, through villages that had seen war too often to raise their heads. Jagiełło rode with the priests at the front, their crucifix swaying beside the royal banner. Behind him, the columns stretched for miles, armor flashing, banners heavy with damp. Vytautas kept to the right flank, his light horse ranging ahead like smoke before the wind. The march was both pilgrimage and ordeal. Rain fell and lifted, then fell again. Hooves sank deep into clay. Carts stuck fast. Men muttered prayers that mixed Latin and pagan echo. In the evenings, the cousins met beneath a canvas lamp to read the scouts' reports. Lines of ink that told of the same enemy moving westward, step for step, toward the same destiny. Every night, the camps grew quieter. Men cleaned weapons that needed no cleaning, spoke of home as if it were already memory. The priests said mass. The Tartars burned incense to their own god. No one tried to correct them. Faith had become a private language now, and war its only translation. When the host reached the lakes of Masuria, the roads narrowed into valleys rimmed with mist. Scouts brought back word. The Teutonic army was near, thousands under the Grand Master's personal command. Jagiełło halted the march and ordered a day of fasting. Bread was broken only after prayers, and men slept hungry. In that hunger, there was unity. Night fell clear. Across the distant plain, fires of the enemy camp flickered like another sky. From their direction came the echo of hymns in Latin, the same prayers the Union had spoken hours before. To those who listened, it was like hearing their own voices returned by a stranger. Men crossed themselves, not from fear, but from understanding. Whatever faith had meant yesterday, tomorrow it would wear armor. Jagiełło stood alone at the edge of the camp, the oak leaves stirring faintly above him. He looked west, where lightning blinked between low clouds. The crucifix hung motionless against his chest, Somewhere out there, beyond the next dawn, waited the field where faith and empire would meet for the last time. The king turned back to the camp, to the murmuring sea of men who had followed him this far, and whispered only one word: tomorrow. The air was damp, and mist clung to the hollows as if the earth itself did not wish to be seen. Dawn came without colour. Out of that whiteness came sound, the muted clang of iron, the steady creak of wagons, the breath of horses. Across the fields between the lakes, armies took shape out of vapour. The world was preparing itself for memory. Jagiełło rose before the trumpets. He had slept little, but his face showed only calm. Outside his tent, dew glittered on grass that would soon be trampled into mud. The chaplain carried the crucifix before him, the same one that had crossed the bridge of boats weeks earlier. The king knelt, whispered his confession, and rose without ceremony. The time for words had passed. The Polish banners began to unfurl with the first light. The white eagle lifted in the east wind, followed by the standards of Krakow, Lublin, and Sandomierz. Armour flashed through the mist like water catching flame. The lines formed slowly, deliberate as prayer. Heavy cavalry in front, infantry behind. Reserves waiting near the hill where the royal tent still stood. Farther right, beyond the low ridge, Vytautas's army gathered in its own tongue and rhythm. The field filled with voices that did not need translation. Vytautas rode among his men, his horses' hooves dark with dew. The Lithuanians had fought the order their whole lives. They needed no speeches to tell them why. Still, he spoke, brief words carried by wind. Today, we end what began with our fathers. They answered not with cheers, but with a deep, rolling sound that might have been the forest itself awakening. To the Tatars on the flank he gave a nod. They touched their foreheads and smiled without joy. Across the meadow, the Teutonic lines were already forming. Ulrich von Jungingen, the Grand Master, rode before his men in a white cloak embroidered with the Black Cross. Behind him marched an army built on pride and habit, German knights, Prussian sergeants, guest crusaders from Burgundy, Saxony, and France. Each wore his own device, but all bent to one rule. Their discipline was a wall of breath and steel. As the sun climbed through the haze, the white of their mantles turned blinding. The Grand Master halted before the altar his chaplains had raised from wagon planks. He knelt, kissed the relic of the true cross, and whispered a vow: to strike down the heretic and defend the faith until death. His knights echoed the words in a single voice. To those watching from afar, it was like the sea drawing breath before a storm. From his hill, Jagiełło watched. He could see the black crosses glimmering, hear the faint murmur of Latin chants. They were praying to the same heaven. He turned to his aide. When they believe they fight for God, he said, we must fight for men. By mid-morning, the mist had begun to lift. Between the armies lay a wide meadow streaked with marsh and wildflowers, its beauty cruel in its indifference. Birds rose in startled clouds as scouts rode back to report positions. Both hosts could see each other clearly now. The knights of the order stood in ordered ranks, their lances angled to catch the sun. The Polish-Lithuanian lines shimmered with colour, red, blue, gold, and the dark greens of forest banners. Two worlds, mirror and opposite, faced each other in the still air. What followed was a silence long enough for doubt. No trumpet sounded. The wind pressed the grass one way, then the other, and men wondered who would break first. It was Ulrich who moved. A trumpet called once, and two riders left his line, envoys in white cloaks, each carrying a naked sword. They halted midway between the armies and spoke in Latin, their voices cutting the distance like knives. The Grand Master sends these swords, one declared, so that the King of Poland and the Duke of Lithuania may arm themselves better for the fight they have called upon themselves. His words were meant as insult. The envoys rode back without waiting for reply. Jagiełło accepted the blades with calm. He ran a gloved hand along one edge, then handed both to his marshals. "Return them to him sharpened," he said, and smiled for the first time that day. The sun climbed higher. Heat settled upon the field, heavy and bright. Men removed their helmets to breathe. Horses tossed their heads, stamping at flies. The king ordered a mass celebrated in the open. Priests lifted their voices against the noise of the enemy's drums. Across the lines, the Teutonic chaplains answered with their own hymns. For a moment, both sides prayed in the same tongue, and the words met in the air between them, twisting together like smoke. When the service ended, Jagiełło mounted again and rode the length of his lines. He said little, but as he passed each banner, men straightened, the tension in their shoulders turning to resolve. He stopped beneath the standard of St. George and looked toward the horizon where white mantles glimmered like snow. "Not yet," he murmured. "Pride rides first. Let it." Hours dragged like years. The Order's army stood motionless under the noon sun, waiting for a sign that never came. Sweat ran in lines down faces. Armor burned to the touch. The Teutonic Knights began to murmur among themselves. Ulrich, unwilling to yield the initiative, raised his sword and gave command to advance. From the crest of the hill, the Polish banners shuddered with anticipation. Vytautas wheeled his horse toward the Lithuanian right. "Now!" he shouted. Drums thundered, hooves struck earth, and the first charge leapt forward, a roar of motion that shattered the stillness. The ground trembled as cavalry poured into the open, arrows rising in arcs toward the advancing white line. The Order's front ranks absorbed the storm, their lances leveled, shields interlocked. When impact came, it was like stone meeting tide. Men vanished in clouds of dust. Horses fell screaming. Banners staggered and righted again. The two armies locked together in the oldest. Conversation, the world knew. Steel answering steel. On the ridge, Jagiełło sat his horse, unmoving, eyes half closed, reading the field through sound. Aides waited for orders that did not come. To them, he seemed indifferent. To those who knew him, he was listening for the rhythm beneath the noise, the heartbeat of the battle itself. Vytautas's first assault faltered, broke, and wheeled away in apparent flight. The Teutonic Knights shouted in triumph and spurred in pursuit, their formation unraveling in eagerness. They chased the Lithuanians toward the woods, where shadows swallowed them. Jagiełło's mouth curved in something almost like satisfaction. "Let them go," he said quietly. "The forest remembers." The center held. Polish banners pressed forward against the remaining lines of the Order. Lances shattered, swords rose and fell in sunlight that turned red as it touched them. Drums beat faster, the ground steamed from the heat of men and horses. Still the king did not move. Patience had won him every crown he wore. From the western edge came the muffled echo of horns, Vytautas returning, his cavalry bursting from the trees onto the enemy flank. The trap closed as neatly as prayer. Jagiełło lifted his hand, and the royal reserve began to move. Thousands advanced beneath the white eagle, their pace steady, measured, unstoppable. The sun caught the gilded cross at the top of the banner, turning it into a star. Across the field, Ulrich saw the shift too late. He gathered what remained of his household knights and charged down the slope, shouting the creed that had carried them through every war before this one. The world answered with a sound like breaking glass. The white cloaks disappeared beneath the crush of red and gold. Even from the hill, the king could see the Grand Master's banner fall. He removed his helmet and bowed his head. Around him, the noise of battle rolled on, unheeding. Victory, he knew, was never the loudest moment. It was the one that came after, when silence began to spread like light. At first, it was the dull rhythm of hooves, the tightening of leather, the low chant of prayers carried on wind. Then, as the sun lifted above the clouds, the meadow of Grunwald came alive with motion. Steel caught the light, banners unfurled, and what had been stillness became roar. Mist drifted from the hollows between the lakes, veiling the lines like incense in a church. Through it moved the Polish and Lithuanian hosts, tens of thousands forming under command, their banners rippling in the morning air. On one side of the field gleamed the white cloaks of the Order. On the other, the living mosaic of the Union, red, blue, gold, and green, stitched together by necessity and by fate. Between them lay a sea of wet grass, unremarkable to the eye, yet destined to carry memory for centuries. From his hilltop, Władysław Jagiełło watched the world arrange itself. The light struck his armor in muted flashes. His horse stood still beneath him, restless yet obedient. Around him gathered his captains, the old veterans of Mazovia, the lords of Krakow, the voivodes whose families had fought these same enemies for 3 generations. They waited for his word, but none came. He was listening to the wind, to the rhythm of his men forming lines, to the far-off thunder that was not yet battle. Across the field, Ulrich von Jungingen raised his standard. Behind him, the disciplined ranks of the Order formed with ritual precision. German banners to the center, guest crusaders on the wings. The reserve held tight near the wagons. Their armor shone like mirrors. Their silence was its own defiance. When the trumpets sounded, they knelt in unison and lifted their eyes toward heaven. The sun caught the black crosses on their mantles, turning them into brief flashes of fire. Vytautas rode along the right flank of the Allied line, the Lithuanian flank, his cloak dark with rain. He checked the positions of his cavalry, spoke to the Tartar captains in short phrases, adjusted the angle of banners so they could be seen through the haze. Around him moved men who had lived through decades of this war and yet never seen its end. They knew what waited beyond the mist. When he turned his horse toward them and raised his sword, the cry that answered him rose above the wind. A raw, wordless sound that seemed to pull strength from the earth itself. The first charge began with that cry. Lithuanian riders surged forward, their horses pounding through the soft ground, arrows hissing into the fog. The Order's left flank held steady, their lances angled like a wall of iron. When the two forces met, the sound was like a gate slamming shut. Armor split, horses screamed, men vanished beneath the crush. Then the lines broke and rolled apart, leaving the field scarred with bodies and churned mud. On the hill, Jagiełło remained motionless. His aides urged him to advance, to commit the center, but he lifted a hand for silence. He had seen this pattern before, the shock of the first assault, the temptation to rush, the cost of impatience. He sent only messengers, riding down through the smoke to carry orders between the banners. His calm steadied the heart of the army more than any shout could have done. Vytautas wheeled his cavalry for a second strike, driving again into the Teutonic flank. This time, the knights countercharged with brutal precision, their formation cutting through the lighter horsemen. Lithuanian units fell back in disorder, some streaming toward the forest line. To those who watched from afar, it seemed a rout. Chroniclers of the order would later call it victory. But Vytautas had planned this retreat. He let the enemy pursue, drawing them out of position, pulling their confidence taut as bowstring. The Teutonic Knights followed, shouting triumph, driving deeper into the woods. Their ranks began to stretch and twist, formation bleeding into chaos. When Vytautas turned his horse again and gave the signal, fresh companies emerged from cover, striking the pursuers' flanks. The forest that had so often hidden pagans now hid vengeance. Within an hour, the white cloaks were falling back toward the center, their order broken. Still, the battle was far from decided. In the open field, the main bodies now collided, the Polish heavy cavalry against the disciplined heart of the order. The ground shook beneath their impact. Shields splintered, banners fell and rose again, the air thick with dust and breath and iron. Priests on both sides lifted crucifixes above the melee, shouting blessings that vanished beneath the noise. The sun climbed higher, burning through the mist until the field gleamed with blood and sweat. From the hill, Jagiełło watched the swirl of motion and raised his hand for the reserve. The royal banner advanced, the great red field with the white eagle, flanked by the standard of St. George and the lion of Lwów. Trumpets answered each other across the chaos. The king's line moved like a single creature of iron and faith, steady, deliberate, unrelenting. On the far ridge, Ulrich saw them coming. He spurred his horse, shouting to his standard-bearers, rallying what strength remained. The order's banners gathered once more into formation, one last, perfect line of defiance. He led the charge himself, sword high, voice ringing through the din. For a moment, it seemed that the field itself tilted toward him, that the tide might turn again. But Vytautas had returned, sweeping from the flank with the Lithuanians renewed. The trap closed. Polish knights met the front, Lithuanian riders struck the side, and the white cloaks vanished beneath the crush. The black cross faltered. The Grand Master fell amid his own banners, his sword still in hand. Those who found him later said his face was calm, almost bewildered, as though he had glimpsed a world without crusade and could not recognize it. By afternoon, the field was a blur of sound and smoke. The sun hung high and merciless. The grass was trampled to mud. Jagiełło rode slowly through the haze, his armor streaked with dust, his voice low as he gave orders to cease the slaughter. The victory was total, but his eyes carried no triumph, only the weight of what centuries had led to this place. When the noise finally faded, the field of Grunwald lay silent under the returning rain. Thousands of fallen men, Polish, German, Lithuanian, lay where they had fought, their banners tangled together in the mud. In that mingled ruin, faith and pride were indistinguishable. The battle was over. The age of crusade had ended, not in glory, but in exhaustion. The next evening came without sunset. The sky was the color of iron, the air thick with the smell of rain and blood. Over the plain of Grunwald, smoke rose in long grey columns, curling around shattered wagons and fallen standards. The wind carried no voices now, only the moan of horses, the distant ringing of hammers, as smiths repaired what could still be used. Everything else lay still. Jagiełło dismounted at the crest of the hill, where he had watched the battle unfold. The grass beneath his boots was blackened and slick. He stood for a long time without speaking. Around him moved his attendants, priests, heralds, men carrying torches, but he saw none of them. His gaze followed the slow movement of scavengers in the distance, peasants creeping from the woods to search for coin or bread among the dead. The king's hand lifted once, a small gesture, and soldiers rode to drive them away. Vytautas approached from the far end of the field, his horse streaked with mud to the flanks. His armor bore dents and dried blood, not all his own. When he reined in beside his cousin, neither man spoke. The silence between them was too heavy for triumph. They looked instead toward the place where the banners of the order had fallen, still visible in the fading light. White cloaks tangled in grass, the black cross half buried in the mire. The Grand Master's body had already been found. It lay near the wagon train, surrounded by his fallen captains. A messenger brought the news formally, kneeling in the mud. Jagiełło nodded once. "See that he is buried with his brothers," he said. "No man who fought for his faith will be left unburied on this ground." Vytautas gave a short, unreadable sound, half agreement, half weariness. Neither mentioned victory. When darkness fell, torches dotted the field like stars sinking into earth. Priests moved among the wounded, murmuring prayers, blessing the dying, with fingers trembling from exhaustion. The smell of wet iron clung to everything. The rain that had begun before dawn returned, washing the blood from armor, turning the soil to paste. Men slipped as they carried their comrades to the fires, where surgeons worked in silence broken only by groans. Near midnight, Jagiełło ordered the royal banner lowered. He did not wish it seen above the dead. In the faint light of the torches, he spoke to his captains, words too low to carry far. They were orders for the next day, pursuit toward Marienburg, caution against overreach, mercy for prisoners. Those who had expected a celebration found only command. The king understood what his younger officers did not, that wars rarely end on the field that wins them. Far from the camp, among the scattered corpses of knights and peasants alike, the crows had already begun to gather. They moved through the rain like black smoke, untroubled by rank or banner. The field belonged to them now, to the indifferent sky, and to the memory that would not fade. By morning, the mist returned. The sun rose pale and cold over the ruins of two armies. Scouts rode across the plain, counting what remained of the enemy, gathering weapons to be consecrated or melted. Here and there a knight still clung to life, whispering prayers that no longer matched the world around him. Monks followed behind the soldiers, reciting psalms for both sides, their voices thin against the emptiness. Vytautas oversaw the burning of the broken wagons. He watched the smoke rise and thought of the decades that had led to this. Raids, betrayals, truces written in frost. Every flame seemed to consume not just timber, but time itself. When one of his captains asked what message should be sent to Vilnius, he said only, "Tell them the forest is avenged." In the royal camp, Jagiełło dictated letters to his scribes. His tone was calm, almost detached. Reports would go to Krakow, to Vilnius, to foreign courts that had doubted his faith and his crown. He spoke of victory without boasting, of divine favor without triumph. Even in conquest, he feared pride more than defeat. To his queen, he sent a single line in his own hand: "God has answered." That afternoon, the two cousins rode together once more across the field. The clouds had lifted. In the sunlight, the carnage seemed unreal, a landscape carved from shadow and silence. Jagiełło reined in at the place where Ulrich had fallen. He looked down at the trampled grass and said quietly, "It is finished." Vytautas made no reply. The wind stirred the torn banners at their feet. Behind them, the armies were already moving south toward the next task, the siege that would decide whether this victory would last. Marienburg awaited, its towers rising untouched on the horizon, the heart of an order that refused to die. Yet for this one day, the world was still. At dusk, the king rode alone to a small rise at the edge of the field. There he dismounted, removed his gloves, and knelt in the mud. He prayed for the fallen, for the living, for the end of what had consumed both. No one heard his words, only the wind answered. When he rose again, night had gathered fully. The fires of the camp flickered below him, and beyond them stretched the silent meadow, already beginning to fade into legend. That morning, after Grunwald, was quiet enough to be mistaken for peace. Mist rose from the hollows between the lakes, curling around the blackened stakes of tents and the bodies that still dotted the field. The rain of the night before had washed the ground clean of colour. Only grey remained, sky, soil, armour. The victors stirred slowly, as if waking from a long dream. Some wept without knowing why. Jagiełło gave the order to march before noon. There was no triumphal procession, no hymns of victory. The king moved among his men with the same calm he had worn before battle, speaking softly, never smiling. "We go west," he said. "While the enemy still breathes, there is no victory." So the long procession began, an army of mud and exhaustion, carrying banners tattered by glory. The road wound through the villages of Prussia, places that had fed the Order's crusades for generations. Doors stood open, their owners fled, or kneeling in fear. At first the soldiers plundered, but Jagiełło's heralds rode ahead, forbidding it. "You conquer by mercy," they proclaimed, "not by fire." The king understood that one act of cruelty could undo what Grunwald had gained. He wanted the chronicles to say that justice, not revenge, had passed this way. Vytautas obeyed in silence, though his temper smouldered beneath the calm. To him, the sword should finish what it had begun. His riders pressed on ahead, taking fortresses that still dared to fly the Black Cross. Some surrendered after a single demand. Others burned to the ground. The Lithuanian banners moved like storm clouds along the border, sweeping away resistance. Each captured castle was left with garrisons loyal to the Union, but already supplies ran thin, and the roads began to dissolve under summer rain. At Thorn, the citizens opened their gates and swore fealty to the new order. In Elbing and Kreisberg, monks led processions bearing relics, praying aloud for mercy. Even the air seemed to change, the proud chants of the crusaders, replaced by quiet bells ringing in repentance. The Teutonic world that had stood for 2 centuries began to fold upon itself like a tent struck by wind. Yet one fortress refused to fall. Marienburg, the Order's seat and soul, loomed ahead on the Nogat River. Built of red brick and iron faith, it had never been taken by siege. Its towers rose above the water like the memory of judgment. As the Allied army approached, the sun caught the walls and turned them blood red. "So," Vytautas murmured, "the heart still beats." They camped on the eastern bank. Engineers marked the ground for artillery, and trenches began to creep toward the moat. Within the fortress, command had fallen to Heinrich von Plauen, a commander who had escaped the slaughter at Grunwald. He was not noble by birth, yet the discipline that drove him seemed carved from the same stone as the walls he defended. With only a few thousand men, he swore to hold until the end. The siege began on the feast of St. Mary Magdalene. Bombards roared from both sides, hurling stone and fire. Each impact shook the river's surface, sending ripples across the reflection of the towers. By day, smoke veiled the sky. By night, the fortress glowed like a furnace. Within, von Plauen's men worked without rest, patching walls, carrying the wounded to chapels now turned to hospitals, melting church bells for shot. Outside, the Allies dug and built, their camp spreading for miles. The air was never silent, Even the prayers seemed to echo with thunder. In those first weeks, optimism carried the host. Many believed Marienburg would fall as easily as the smaller castles had. But stone endures when faith sustains it. The order had lost its army, yet its spirit had condensed into this single citadel. And as the siege dragged on, the victors learned that victory is the beginning of endurance, not its end. Rain returned, unceasing and cold. The trenches filled with mud. Supply wagons sank axle deep. Food ran short, water turned foul, and sickness began its slow harvest. Nobles grew restless, soldiers muttered in camp. Vytautas urged an assault, furious that time should undo what his sword had achieved. Jagiełło refused. Walls can wait, he said, but famine fights for no one. Their difference widened with each passing day. The Grand Duke wanted conquest. The king wanted control. To Jagiełło, rashness was defeat disguised as valor. He had not spent a lifetime outwaiting crusaders, only to be undone by haste. Yet for all his patience, he could not command the weather, nor the hunger, nor the hearts of men grown weary of glory. Autumn crept over the camps, and with it the smell of decay. Inside Marienburg, von Plauen read these signs and took courage. He sent messengers disguised as fishermen downriver, carrying pleas for aid to the western towns. His appeals reached merchants, bishops, and the princes of the empire. They read of holy warriors trapped by heretics and wept in profitable indignation. Coin and men began to trickle eastward. The order, long thought dead, was quietly raising its head again. When the first rumors of reinforcements reached the Allied camp, Jagiełło called his council. The meeting lasted until dawn. Vytautas argued for one final storming of the walls. Polish commanders warned that the army could not survive another month. Jagiełło listened, silent as ever, then spoke. A man who wins a crown must also know when to put it down. We have broken the order's sword. Now we must not impale ourselves upon its hilt. The decision was made. Before sunrise, the army began to withdraw. The guns were spiked, the trenches abandoned to water and ash. Columns moved eastward along the same roads they had come, carrying with them the silence of disappointment. Behind them, von Plauen's men stood on the ramparts, too stunned to cheer. They watched their enemies disappear into the rain, then turned to rebuild their fortress, stone by stone. For the victors, the retreat felt like loss. Vytautas rode apart, refusing company. His anger was wordless, the anger of a man who had seen triumph dissolve into waiting. To him, Marienburg's survival was a stain on honor. Jagiełło, however, saw further. He knew the order's strength was spent, its authority cracked. To destroy it completely would invite new crusaders from the empire, new wars dressed in holiness. Better to leave it alive, wounded and humbled, than to rouse it reborn. By winter, the Allies reached the Vistula again. The frozen river gleamed under pale light, reflecting the banners of men who had carried victory too far to call it joy. Along the way, they passed the fields where spring had once promised salvation. Villagers came out to greet them, kneeling, singing hymns of deliverance. To these people, the war was already legend. To those who had fought it, the echo of cannon still rang in the ears. In Krakow, bells rang for victory. In Vilnius, for thanksgiving. Letters from the Pope praised the defense of Christian order, ignoring that it had been Christians who fought on both sides. Chroniclers already shaped the story into miracle. The heathen turned king, the fall of arrogance, the triumph of faith. Jagiełło allowed them their illusions. History, he knew, required simplicity. Truth seldom did. One evening, as snow began to fall, The king walked alone along the frozen riverbank. The air was still, the world reduced to white and silence. He thought of Grunwald and of Marienburg, of the noise and the waiting. Behind him lay the memory of fire. Ahead, only the quiet labor of rebuilding. He wondered whether peace could ever outlast men who prayed for war. From far away, a bell sounded, faint, slow, distant. It was impossible to tell whether it came from Krakow or from Marienburg itself, that fortress still standing against the dusk. Jagiełło listened until the sound faded, then crossed himself. Victory, he knew, was never the end of thunder, only its echo, carried by the wind. Winter crept down from the north with the inevitability of fatigue. The roads turned to ice, rivers sealed their surfaces with glass, and the armies of the Union scattered to their homes. What had begun as crusade and counter-crusade dissolved into letters, negotiations, and the low murmur of quills over parchment. The thunder of Grunwald had faded into whisper. In the halls of Marienburg, the survivors of the order moved like ghosts among the stones they had saved. Heinrich von Plauen ruled now as Grand Master, his name spoken with both reverence and fear. He had done what no one expected. He had held the fortress against the tide. Yet his triumph was cold comfort. The walls still bore black scars from bombardment, and the treasury stood nearly empty. The once glorious brotherhood was reduced to weary men praying in unheated chapels, their cloaks patched and threadbare. Faith had not left them, but the certainty that faith would always prevail had. Von Plauen sent envoys westward, appealing to the princes of the empire for aid. Few answered. The German lords were cautious now. They had seen how easily divine purpose could crumble. Some sent coin, others polite words, none an army. The Pope offered blessings and silence. Christendom, for which the order had bled for 2 centuries, had turned its eyes elsewhere. The brothers prayed louder, as if volume might replace numbers. Across the border in Poland, the victory grew colder with each passing month. Jagiełło returned to Krakow in a procession that seemed muted, even to those who cheered. The bells rang, the banners fluttered, yet beneath the celebration lingered unease. Peace, once the most distant of dreams, had finally come, and no one knew what to do with it. The nobles wanted spoils, the clergy wanted reform, the soldiers wanted purpose. The king gave them none. "The Lord has ended the crusade," he said. "Let us not build another in its place." In Vilnius, Vytautas received the news of the withdrawal with quiet bitterness. To him, unfinished conquest was a wound that would not close. He rode north through the frozen forests to see for himself what had been left undone. From the high bank of the Niemen, he looked toward the horizon where Marienburg stood unseen but unfallen. "One fortress," he said, "and the world still trembles before it." Then he turned away. The war had made him famous. Peace would make him restless. By early 1411, emissaries from both sides gathered in the town of Thorn to shape the terms that would end the long century of fire. The hall where they met was lit by a single hearth. Its walls hung with the banners of both realms. Jagiełło's diplomats arrived first, men of law and patience, chosen for their ability to speak without passion. Von Plauen's envoys came days later, gaunt and hollow-eyed, carrying documents sealed in black wax. Each delegation carried the same weariness. Negotiations lasted through the long nights of February. The air smelled of ink, smoke, and wet wool. Between sessions, the clerks wrote by candlelight, their shadows enormous on the walls. Every article of peace was contested: territory, tribute, prisoners, the question of Samogitia. Voices rose, broke, fell again. Outside, the wind scraped against the shutters, like memory demanding entry. At last, an agreement was reached. The first piece of thorn. The order would keep its fortress, but pay vast indemnities to Poland and Lithuania. Zamogitia would remain under Lithuanian rule, at least for a time. The crusade was declared ended. The rivers that had run red would run clean again. Both sides signed with hands that shook from exhaustion. The pens scratched their verdict over 2 centuries of blood. When the treaty was read aloud, no cheer followed. The words were too fragile to carry such weight. Von Plauen's envoys bowed and left the hall without looking back. Jagiełło's delegates stood in silence, knowing that victory on parchment is seldom equal to victory in the field. The peace was real enough, but so was the cold that seeped through the stone walls, reminding all present how easily fire becomes memory. In the months that followed, messengers carried copies of the treaty across Europe. In Rome, it was proclaimed as a triumph of Christian unity. In Prague and Vienna, scholars debated whether the age of crusade had ended or merely changed its name. In Prussia, peasants whispered that the order's God had abandoned them. In Poland, that God had finally chosen wisely. Yet for all their talk, the borders remained haunted by uncertainty. Jagiełło ruled with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through war. He spent his days hearing petitions, judging disputes, rebuilding the treasuries drained by battle. To those who sought grand gestures, he offered patience. To those who sought vengeance, he offered prayer. Strength, he told his council, is not in the blow, but in the hand that can still be steady after striking. He had learned that mercy, too, can be a weapon when wielded by the victor. Vytautas returned to Vilnius and threw himself into the labor of rule. He rebuilt the cities, invited craftsmen from Riga and Danzig, raised churches beside the ruins of shrines. Yet the fire within him never cooled. He dreamed still of a crown, of independence from Poland, of the day when Lithuania might stand alone in the councils of kings. For now, he worked beside his cousin, bound by shared triumph and unspoken rivalry. In Marienburg, von Plauen strengthened the walls and drilled the remnants of his brotherhood until exhaustion replaced despair. He sent letters to every priory of the order, commanding obedience, reminding them that God tested his servants through loss. But when he prayed at the high altar, he found no comfort in the echo of his own voice. The age of holy certainty had ended. He was the warden of its tomb. The fortress endured, but its heart had changed. Pilgrims no longer came seeking indulgence. The fields around it grew wild. Traders passed without fear, and the river that once carried warships now bore only barges of grain. The Black Cross still flew from the towers, but its shadow no longer frightened the land beneath it. In time, even that shadow would fade. The chroniclers would later write that the world itself grew quieter after 1411. No more crusades were called for the Baltic. No more indulgences were granted for slaughter. Europe had turned its face toward other frontiers, other ambitions. Yet the echoes of the order's prayers still lingered in the monasteries, carried by habit more than conviction. The faithful had not vanished. They had merely grown tired. On a night near the end of that year, snow fell thick over Marienburg. Von Plauen stood at the parapet, his breath a ghost before him, listening to the bells marking midnight. In the distance, he imagined he could hear other bells, those of Krakow or Vilnius, answering across the frozen plains. For the first time in his life, he did not know whether they tolled for victory or for warning. Far away, Jagiełło knelt in his private chapel, a single candle burning beside the crucifix. He prayed not for conquest, but for remembrance. He asked that the blood spilled at Grunwald might mean more than vengeance, that the generations to come might learn to live beneath peace without tearing it apart to prove their strength. Outside, the snow fell the same over every border, covering graves without asking who had prayed for which god. The thunder had passed, but its echo endured, in stones, in chronicles, in the uneasy silence of men who had survived the end of an age. The Crusader world was gone. What remained was waiting, the long, slow birth of something neither pagan nor holy, only human. Victory's rumors reached Europe before the king's own messengers. Letters copied and recopied blurred the names of villages until only one survived: Grunwald. From the Rhineland to Rome, men whispered that the great crusaders of the north had been broken by those they once called heathen. To some, the news was miracle. To others, blasphemy. The 13th century's dream of holy conquest had ended in a muddy field, and no one yet knew what would rise in its place. Krakow greeted its returning soldiers without pageantry. Smoke still hung above the chimneys from the last candles of Thanksgiving. Merchants opened their shops. Peasants watched the procession without shouting. It was relief, not triumph, that filled the city. The relief of a people who had feared extinction for too long to recognize deliverance when it came. The banners carried through the square were tattered, their saints' faces half erased by rain. Yet the people knelt, because kneeling was what they had learned to do when history passed overhead. Władysław Jagiełło dismounted at the cathedral steps and climbed them slowly, his armor dulled by travel. In the nave, the air smelled of wax and wet stone. He knelt, not before the relics of victory, but before the silence that followed it. His courtiers waited for a proclamation and received only stillness. The king, who had outweighted crusaders, would now outweight celebration as well. Far to the northeast, Vilnius welcomed Vytautas home with louder devotion. The Grand Duke rode through streets newly paved with pine branches, the crowd pressing so close that soldiers had to clear his way with their spears reversed. Bells rang from the cathedral he had built atop the ruins of the last pagan temple. The people shouted his name in 10 accents. Their joy mingled with awe. They had seen fire leave their forests and return as sunlight on stone. Vytautas accepted their praise as a man accepts weather, neither inviting nor refusing it. He had measured his life in campaigns, and the habit of movement did not loosen with victory. Within weeks he rode again, inspecting fortresses, rebuilding bridges, tracing the river lines that divided survival from surrender. The war had ended, but the work of making its meaning had only begun. Across the defeated lands, the Black Cross still flew, smaller now, above fortresses spared by prudence. The Order's brothers lived like monks in armor, their prayers disciplined but thin. Heinrich von Plauen ruled from Marienburg with the grim virtue of necessity. The fortress stood scarred but intact, its towers as defiant as its master. Inside its walls, rule had hardened into ritual. Bells marked the hours, but time itself had stopped. Faith endured as habit, and habit, in its own way, endured as faith. The king refused to finish the destruction. He knew that complete victories invite new crusades. Mercy, measured and public, became his strongest weapon. Envoys carried his orders through Prussia. No vengeance, no pillage, no persecution of monks. He allowed the brothers to rebuild and to pay indemnities instead of tribute. The policy baffled warriors who had expected conquest, but it bound Europe's sympathy to his cause. The former pagan had become the continent's model of Christian restraint. In Krakow, the court adjusted to a rhythm of administration. days filled with councils, decrees, and the rustle of parchment. Diplomats from Hungary, Bohemia, and the Empire arrived to test the boundaries of the new alliance. Jagiełło received them with an evenness that disarmed suspicion. His voice remained quiet, his answers slow, his presence heavy with the kind of patience that makes opposition seem childish. He had learned that power spoken too quickly exhausts itself. Vilnius followed another pulse. Vytautas turned his victory into structure. Stone replaced timber. Markets grew where garrisons had stood. Craftsmen came from the west to teach guilds their trades, and scholars arrived from Prague to train the clergy who would preach in languages older than Latin. The Grand Duke wanted a realm that could no longer be called frontier. Where the old gods had reigned in groves, towers now rose. Where crusaders had built castles, merchants opened counting houses. Lithuania had entered history on its own terms. Between the cousins, distance returned, but without bitterness. Letters travelled between Krakow and Vilnius, bearing the same courtesy and the same reserve. They no longer shared campaigns, but shared something harder to define, a memory of having survived their century. The union they had forged held, not because affection demanded it, but because exhaustion forbade its undoing. What war had bound, peace lacked the energy to separate. The Teutonic Order remained, diminished but alive. Von Plauen governed like a steward of relics. He ordered the chronicles of the defeat written with dignity, as though precision might redeem disgrace. The scribes obeyed, setting down the names of the fallen with the same calm they once used for miracles. Within a decade, the order had become its own historian, a brotherhood maintaining archives rather than armies. In the new calm, trade filled the void left by crusade. Ships laden with grain and amber replaced the fleets of armed pilgrims. Monasteries that had once prayed for victory now prayed for good harvests. The merchants of Danzig and Thorn prospered. Their ledgers carried more weight than papal bulls. Profit accomplished what faith could not. It made coexistence reasonable. The chroniclers of other lands treated the battle as a sign that the world was turning. Some wrote that God had granted peace to nations grown weary of righteousness. Others saw in it the rise of a new order where princes, not popes, would decide when heaven required war. Each interpretation found its way into parchment and song. In them, Jagiełło became the archetype of temperance and Vytautas, the figure of strength tempered by purpose. The rest of the world turned their names into symbols and forgot that they were men who still aged in rooms lit by ordinary candles. Seasons that followed revealed the difference between endurance and rest. The king's patience thickened into solitude. He spent long evenings reading the reports of his officials, correcting numbers in the margins, shaping law as though it were another campaign. He governed as one might pray, repetitively, faithfully, without expectation of reward. Around him, courtiers learned the lesson he never stated. The noise of victory is useful only until the ink dries. Vytautas aged harder. The fire that had driven him through war refused to cool. He began to imagine a Lithuania crowned, not merely allied. He wrote to the emperors, courted the papal legates, arranged treaties that would recognize his sovereignty. The idea of coronation grew from rumor into plan, and by the late 1420s, the ceremony had a date. Crowns were cast, banners embroidered, ambassadors invited. For a moment it seemed that the Grand Duke who had outlived crusade would end his life as king. Fate, which had spared him in battle, found him unarmed in peace. Fever struck as preparations began. He continued dictating orders until speech left him. then drifted between wakefulness and the kind of dreaming that turns memory into prophecy. When he died, the bells of Vilnius rang for 7 days. His funeral filled the streets with smoke and song. The people who had once feared the loss of their old gods now mourned a ruler who had carried them safely through the crossing from one age to another. For Jagiełło, his cousin's death was both wound and warning. He ruled another decade, steady and austere, his gestures smaller, but his reach undiminished. The nobles who had doubted him learned that silence can be a form of command. He signed charters, reconciled factions, and built churches on the sites where crusaders had fallen. Time had become his last weapon, and he used it sparingly. The brothers of the order prayed through those same years inside walls that had ceased to frighten anyone. Their chronicles grew longer, their borders shorter. They called the world outside heretical for changing. The world called them fortunate for surviving. What had once been the vanguard of Christendom had turned into a memory guarded by accountants. Their decline was not dramatic. It was polite, administrative, precise. By the time the king's own strength began to fade, the map of the north had settled into new proportion. Trade routes cut across old battlefields. The last traces of pagan ritual had folded into folklore. The union of Poland and Lithuania stood as a hinge between worlds, half anchored in faith, half reaching toward reason. The order still kept its fortress, but its purpose had leaked away like oil from an unlit lamp. The king felt that silence gathering around him. He visited monasteries where monks copied the story of his reign onto vellum, leaving blanks for dates not yet known. In the cloisters, he walked as slowly as the echoes behind him, his thoughts turning more often toward the patience that had brought him this far. History, he knew, is never written by those who hurry. Winter of 1434 found him on pilgrimage along the southern frontier. The journey was meant for prayer, not for politics, yet his courtiers marked each stop as though it were inspection. In a village church of rough timber, he took the sacrament, his hands steady, his expression untroubled. Before dawn, he was dead, the crucifix still clasped against his chest. When the bells of Wałęsa rang, they did not toll despair, but acknowledgement. A generation that had outlived crusade was passing into memory. The sound carried north, across forests and rivers, toward the plains where grass had already swallowed iron. Shepherds paused and listened, hearing only wind. The field that had changed the shape of the world now lay quiet, holding its secret beneath the roots. The age of the lion and the eagle was ending, but its shadow remained, long, indistinct, unbroken. After the bells of Wałęsa fell silent, Europe did not notice the passing of the man who had changed its shape. History rarely pauses for those who finish their work quietly, but the echo of his age lingered like a voice behind a closing door. The years that followed moved differently, slower in gesture, yet quicker in ambition, as though the world had exhaled after a century spent holding its breath. The Teutonic Order endured in its fortress on the Nogat. Marienburg's towers rose the same as ever, though the stone beneath them had lost its authority. Within its cloisters, the brothers kept to their hours: bells, prayer, meal, silence. Each cycle an act of memory rather than faith. Their chronicles became ledgers, their relics inventory. In place of crusade, they managed estates, hired scribes, and rented ships to merchants. The iron discipline that had once driven them to conquest now bound them to survival. They had outlived the reason for their existence and were learning, awkwardly, to endure without purpose. The lands around them healed with a patience that history seldom grants. Where armies had marched, barley rose again. Forests reclaimed the trenches. villages rebuilt where smoke had once been the only landmark. The same rivers that had carried corpses and armor now carried grain, amber, and cloth. Commerce replaced pilgrimage, and the North discovered that profit could be a gentler master than piety. Ports that had once sent out crusaders now sent out traders, and the wind that filled their sails was the first wind of modernity. In time, the crusading state turned into a border principality, its power measured not by swords, but by treaties. The Grand Masters became administrators, their authority shrinking with each census. The Black Cross still hung from the walls of Marienburg, but it fluttered like a flag left up out of habit. The Brotherhood's decline was slow, methodical, almost polite, an erosion of meaning rather than of structure. Faith, stripped of its enemies, found itself unnecessary. In Poland and Lithuania, the memory of the great battle settled into myth. Painters gave it form, poets gave it music, and preachers gave it moral. The field of Grunwald became less a place than a parable. To the Poles, it was the moment when patience had triumphed. To the Lithuanians, the proof that survival could become destiny. Even the Order, in its remaining chronicles, preserved the story as an example of divine mystery, a punishment sent not by men, but by heaven for the sin of pride. Every nation found its own reflection in the mirror of that day, and mirrors, once hung, refused to come down. The 15th century turned toward other frontiers. The compass replaced the relic. The merchant and the scholar displaced the knight. In the universities of Krakow and Prague, students read not chronicles of saints, but treatises on the motion of planets. Trade routes multiplied, and with them, languages that could discuss profit more easily than salvation. The Baltic became less a battleground and more a marketplace, its ships carrying not warriors, but goods and news. The idea of Christendom as fortress gave way to Europe as argument. Marienburg remained, an island of brick in the tide of change. Travellers wrote of its silence, of corridors echoing with the footsteps of a garrison reduced to habit. They described the refectory where no laughter rose, the chapel where light fell through stained glass onto empty benches. The Order had built its fortress to outlast the world, and in that ambition it succeeded. It stood because the age that had made it could not quite bear to erase itself completely. Ruin would have been release. Endurance was the punishment. As decades passed, the fortress slowly became a relic of itself. Artists sketched its towers as curiosities. Princes visited it as they might a monument to vanished virtue. Even the brothers began to record their history with detachment, as though they were chronicling the deeds of strangers. When new wars broke across Europe, they found themselves forgotten, too small to threaten, too stubborn to die. The sound of their bells no longer reached beyond the river. The North grew prosperous under the same sun that had once watched its ruin. The union of Poland and Lithuania flourished into a realm that stretched from the Baltic to the steppe, its strength built on the balance its founders had left behind. The name of Jagiełło became dynasty. His patience turned into policy. Vytautas' image watched over the court in Vilnius, his features softened by the centuries, until even his sternness seemed paternal. Together, their memory bound two peoples that might otherwise have drifted apart. Their war had ended an age. Their legacy began a new one. Generations later, children learned the story differently. In their lessons, the Crusaders wore arrogance like armor. The victors rode beneath banners clean of ambiguity. The chronicler's doubts had been replaced by clarity. History, like faith, demands absolutes. What had once been exhaustion turned into virtue. What had been calculation into miracle. The field of Grunwald ceased to belong to the living. It became a legend of beginnings, not of endings. In the 16th century, reformers would look back on the order's decline as prophecy, a sign that no church built on conquest could endure. Humanists studying old manuscripts found in Jagiełło's diplomacy the first whisper of reason against dogma. The scholars did not remember the mud or the smell of horses. They remembered the letters, the treaties, the gestures of restraint. Out of that memory, the Renaissance in the north took its first hesitant breath. But for those who lived along the old frontier, history remained a landscape. The rivers still carried their stories. The soil still offered up relics each spring. Farmers ploughing new fields turned up rusted helms, arrowheads, fragments of mail. Children played with them until the metal crumbled to dust. The war had ended, but it refused to vanish. It had become part of the ground itself. By the time Marienburg finally fell to disuse, no one thought of it as sacred. The fortress turned into granary, then barracks, then museum. The black cross over its gate faded to a shadow in the brick. Inside, the vaulted halls kept the smell of damp stone and candle smoke. Visitors walked through them whispering, as if entering a church whose God had long departed. Guides spoke of the past in measured tones, avoiding both judgment and nostalgia. The building endured, its walls so thick that even forgetting could not penetrate them. Centuries passed. The nations that had once fought for salvation fought now for borders, for language, for independence. Empires came and went, each claiming descent from the same myths. When they spoke of Grunwald, they spoke of identity rather than faith. The story adapted because stories that survive must learn to serve whoever remembers them. Yet beneath every retelling, the same truth persisted, that one summer's day had marked the end of an age when men believed the sky would choose sides. On the plain itself, nothing survived of the armies. Grass grew over the graves. The lakes reflected only clouds. Travelers found it hard to believe that so much noise could have been contained in so small a space. The earth offered no evidence except its quiet. Yet locals still pointed to the horizon and said that, when storms rolled in from the sea, thunder came from beneath the ground as well as from above. They said the horses were still running, unseen, their hooves shaking the soil like memory refusing to sleep. The story endured because it carried both pride and warning. It reminded kings that power, once sanctified, tends to consume its priests. It reminded commoners that patience can outlast iron. It lived on in the space between faith and reason, a monument built not of stone but of understanding. Every age found in it what it needed: redemption, justice, nationhood, caution. Legends are useful precisely because they are never finished. And so the age of crusaders ended not with fire, but with forgetting. The swords rusted, the prayers dulled, the certainties of salvation dissolved into policy and trade. The men who had carried banners for God left behind ledgers for their heirs. Only the land remembered, because land has no choice. Each spring, the rain washed over the plain, sinking into soil that had once been mud and blood. From it rose wildflowers, red and white, their roots twined through the remnants of armor no one would ever find again. When the wind moves across that place, it carries the same whisper it did on the morning before the battle, the sound of breath drawn before decision, the pause between thunder and silence. The field belongs to no nation, no faith, no century. It belongs to the memory of what humanity believed about itself, when it still thought holiness could be forged in iron. The lion and the eagle sleep now beneath the same horizon. Their banners are dust, their empires absorbed into time, their names turned to lessons. Yet when storms rise over the Baltic and the clouds roll low across the plain, the air trembles with an old rhythm. It is not war returning, but remembrance, the heartbeat of an age that ended itself, still echoing softly through the grass.